Thanks for coming out again for this last talk on Thomas Merton. And, the theme we've been looking at is the theme that drove, that energized, and that grounded the life of Thomas Merton, this famous Trappist monk from the middle of the last century. And that question is, what is contemplation? Even though he wrote about a lot of peace issues and justice issues, he wrote stuff about literary choices and literary reviews. He had a wide, kind of diverse range of interests. Everything came back to that issue, contemplation. And just as kind of a review of these last 2 weeks, very, very briefly, he settled on, it's hard for me to even choose one phrase, but if I had to, the phrase that I'd use to describe contemplation from Thomas Merton comes from New Seeds of Contemplation, which is probably the work that people will continuously read from Thomas Merton. So if you wanted somewhere to start, again, just as an aside, if you wanted to read something other than a reader, I was recommending this reader earlier. This is from the Modern Spiritual Masters series by Orbis Books, Thomas Merton Essential Writings. But if you didn't want a reader and you just wanted to dive into one of his books, New Seeds of Contemplation is probably the place to go. But in that book, in the very first chapter, in the very first few pages, he calls contemplation awakening to reality. And that means God. God is reality, absolute reality. But God's not another thing in reality. And that is maybe the single biggest mistake religion has made, is to treat God as another thing in reality. Kind of like, this is now LJ speaking, but I've always thought that our cultural image of God is more akin to Zeus than to the living God of the Bible. Zeus, is clearly a man, long white beard, right? And do you have any relatives that will say, if I set foot in a church, God will zap me dead or send a lightning bolt to strike me down? That is not the living God of the Bible, that's Zeus. And Zeus is a being. And maybe you've heard God referred to as supreme being, right? A supreme being. That's not really the God of the Bible. That's not the God Merton is describing. He was so very taken with the incomprehensible God. The God who is pure mystery. And in that regard, God who is not a thing, the God who is nothingness. But not in a negative sense. Just that God is beyond all things, beyond being. So that's what contemplation is. It's awakening, you could say, to the divine nothingness, who is at the same time mercy within mercy within mercy. How do we do contemplation? That's what we looked at last week. And the answer is actually quite simple for Thomas Merton. Silence. Solitude. That's how you do contemplation. But because this great and glorious mystery that created the universe is within us, we go within to practice silence. We go within to practice solitude. So that means, and there are a lot of different methods that we mentioned last week, but that means silencing your thinking and resting in God in faith. That's all it means. A gentle resting. Remember his advice to, at that time, a novice, but he's now a psychotherapist. His name is James Finley, spiritual writer today. He told James Finley that when you pray, you shouldn't be trying so hard. And he said, well, what do I do then? And he replied, well, what does an apple do to ripen in the sun? It just sits there. So let yourselves ripen in God. That's all you have to do. This week, building on that, what is contemplation and how do we do it? I want to look at an issue that kind of vexed him, and that still vexes a lot of people. How do we reconcile contemplation with the world? And so he wrote a series of essays in a book called Contemplation in a World of action. The classic framing of the discussion is, at least in the church for centuries, the contemplative life or the active life. And monastic orders, the Trappists, the Carthusians, the Benedictines, there's a lot of different institutional, canonical orders in the church that are all, let's organize our life around contemplation. But they don't really have necessarily an active ministry. And then you have groups like Franciscans and Dominicans and Jesuits and other groups that are kind of a mix of the two. They have an active ministry. I went to a Franciscan college. They were very involved. I don't know how many of them were contemplatives, but they were very involved in our life, in the campus life. How do you mix them, though? Because he was getting input from people. You have time for contemplation, but what about the world? We have problems out in the world. Now, the funny thing is, if you are living a contemplative life, you can see what people are calling problems, but you realize deep down there is no problem. Richard Rohr, do you remember, maybe you do, maybe you don't, he wrote a book called Everything Belongs. I think it's actually his best-selling book, and it's a book on contemplative prayer. But it's the experience that, everything is radically okay. There's nothing to fear. Who says that? Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. Somebody I know, right? What does the contemplative offer the world? I want to give you 3 things the contemplative offers the world, based on what Thomas Merton has written. And the first thing is the contemplative, the person who is seeking God, gives the world the experience of God. So just by being, just doing silence and solitude in your own lives, you are affecting the world very deeply. The contemplative transmits the experience of God as absolute reality, divine nothingness, mercy within mercy within mercy, just by presence. So I want to tell you a little story about Merton. James Finley, the same guy who is the spiritual writer, psychotherapist, he tells this story. It happened to him. James Finley is from Akron, Ohio, and he grew up in an abusive household. But he remembers reading the Sign of Jonas as a teenager and being taken with it. So taken with it that I guess Ohio, at that point, that area of Ohio is not that far from Gethsemane in Kentucky. He decided, I want to go be a Trappist at Thomas Merton's monastery. And so he joined the Trappists as a teenager, a late teenager. And that's when Merton was the head of novices. So at least every week he did a class for novices, maybe more than once a week. And then he was kind of their spiritual director. Well, Jim Finley recalls being very nervous to talk to him because he had an abusive father. He had a real problem with authority figures. And he remembers he went to talk to Merton for, the first time. And he was stammering and not quite able to get his words out. And Merton said, "What's going on here?" And I think James Finley was kind of caught off guard. He didn't realize how vulnerable he was in that moment. And instead of berating Jim Finley and maybe recognizing that there was an issue with authority, I think Jim Finley may have even mentioned that to Thomas Merton, or at least a little bit of it, to kind of take the edge off and to say, I'm not really an authority figure in the way you think. He said, I want you to do this. Every night before Vespers, I want you to come and talk to me about pigs. Because James Finley his job in the monastery was to look after the pigs. And so every day, before Vespers, for about half an hour, Jim would walk into Thomas Merton's office and talk about pigs. Just to kind of go, hey, at one point, James Finley says, I realized we were just 2 guys. That him being Thomas Merton faded. That kind of big, starry-eyed presence faded. And that was just 2 men, 2 regular men talking about pigs. And then he says that after he left the monastery, he got into Merton's writings. But he says that not anything he's written, nothing he's written affected him as deeply as that conversation just about pigs. That's what I mean when I say the contemplative offers an experience of God. He did not, Thomas Merton, in those talks with Jim Finley, they didn't talk about heavenly matters. They didn't talk about even the Bible. These are two monks even. They didn't even talk about the Bible. He talked with him about pigs. And Merton apparently knew all the names of the pigs and how each one was doing. But he wanted to hear what Jim had to say. So this is what the contemplative offers. And a transmission of the mystery of God beyond words and thoughts to the very core of one's being. Last week we talked about two attitudes towards life, the sacred attitude and the secular attitude. This is in Merton's book, The Inner Experience. And he comments there that secular life, and he doesn't just mean, life in the strip malls and the secular centers of our society. He also means in our churches. He just means that this is an attitude that's in our minds. He sees an attitude of diversion, of distraction. And he quotes what's the gentleman's name? Pascal, philosopher from the 1600s. Pascal says, "Nothing is so unbearable to a man as to be completely at rest, without passions, without business, without diversion, without study. He then feels his nothingness, his falseness, his insufficiency, his dependence, his weakness, his emptiness." And so, naturally, we want to run from that. But the contemplative dives into that. And you remember the first week we said that's what dread is. Oh, that was last week. We said that's what dread is. Merton names it dread. That you don't just go into silence and feel peace and joy and harmony, but you actually come face to face, as Pascal says, with your own falseness, your own insufficiency, your own dependence. So at the same time that you're meeting the nothingness of God, you're meeting your own insufficient nothingness. Secular society, Merton says, is committed to diversion. But the truly sacred attitude toward life is in no sense an escape from the sense of nothingness that assails us when we are left alone with ourselves. Just stop there. You know exactly what he's talking about. Everybody in this room does. When we've been alone and that sense of just maybe meaninglessness or terror, kind of a terror, maybe it's a quiet terror, grips us. It's just a sense of emptiness, maybe. He says the contemplative dives into that experience because that we have to kind of go deep down below that, and that's where God is. And he says that's a sacred attitude, to not run from that, but accept it. It penetrates into that darkness and that nothingness, realizing that the mercy of God has transformed our nothingness into his temple, and believing that in our darkness, his light has hidden itself. The acceptance of our own inner poverty brings to us a true compassion for others. Maybe I can come back to you next year and talk about Julian of Norwich, if you'd like, because she has, as far as I'm concerned, the best definition of sin. She says, sin is pain. Blows me away every time I think of it. Sin is pain. Think about the people you know that are selfish. Let's just keep it that simple. Who are the selfish people you know? Maybe you can name some from public life. Every one of those people is in pain. They're all in pain. And they're acting out of their pain. It's very simple, of course. My wife is a psychiatric nurse practitioner, and she sees it time and time again. When someone comes to her office, she used to work in the University of Maryland Medical Center in Baltimore, And again and again, she'd see men, for instance, who had sexually abused an adult woman or maybe a child because they themselves were abused. Now, I'm not trying to obviously excuse them, but it's a dynamic psychiatry recognizes, correct? They're spreading their pain, acting out their pain. Merton is saying that when we go into the silence, we're going into the very ground of being. And if it's the very ground of my being, it's the very ground of your being. We're touching people actually at a level no one reaches them at. It's a level that can heal that pain. And we begin to see that as we move through our lives. When we have the silence and the solitude, Merton would also say it's a detachment from our own false selves. We see beyond the false self in others. We see the pain that is giving rise to that false self, and we can even, just by our presence, bring some healing in. Have you been around someone, just their mere presence, they don't even have to say anything, lifts you up? Four of my idiot friends and I, in college, we drove a van down to Atlanta, Georgia. I went to a college in Siena College in Loudonville, New York. It's upstate New York. And we wanted to go just check out the Coca-Cola Museum, and we drank a bunch of Coca-Cola. We all got sick. But I managed to convince them to go to another Trappist monastery outside of Atlanta, Georgia, which is in Conyers. And it was, at the time, the abbot was Basil Pennington. Does anybody know Basil Pennington? Who died tragically in a car accident in 2008. But Basil was the abbot then. So we get to the monastery, we're at the bookstore, we had kind of looked around the grounds, and in the bookstore I noticed one of the monks comes in, and I just go over to him and I say, "Hey, how you doing? I'm LJ. Basil Pennington's not around, is he?" And he says, "Well, actually, yeah, he is. I'm his secretary. Would you like to meet him?" I thought, yeah, I would. Basil Pennington in all his monkish Santa Claus-like glory, because he looks like Santa Claus. He really does. Like a tall, thin Santa Claus. He came out and he talked to me and my friends. My friends, they're college. They're just college morons. Not that I wasn't. But our mood was kind of like here. He brought us up to like a 10. We were at a 4. He brought us up to 10. He did not say the words God or Jesus or love. He didn't use any word found, technical word from the Bible. He just made fun of us for coming down here to go see the Coca-Cola Museum, for getting sick on all the Coca-Cola, and just generally listened and smiled with us and laughed with us. And I realize now, looking back at that, he communicated God to us. He transmitted the ultimate presence to us simply by his presence. So it can be a monk, it can be like a favored grandparent, it can be one of the sacred elders here at this church, or it could be anybody. It could be someone you pass by in the supermarket. Just all of a sudden they raise you up. That's what I mean. The contemplative is able to see in them also below the surface and to guess at the presence of the inner and innocent self that is also the image of God. This is Merton. Such a one is able to help others to find God in themselves, educating them in confidence by the respect he is able to feel for them. That's marvelous. That he's not talking about something like I'm doing right now. He's not talking about necessarily preaching. He's not talking about you saying anything special or wonderful or doing anything special or wonderful. So just see how this builds off his idea of solitude. That to be in solitude is nothing special. As in, it's a high, ecstatic religious experience. His life in the hermitage was Psalms, darkness, coffee, looking out the window, writing a little bit, silent prayer, going to bed. nothing at all superhuman. I don't think that's what he's asking of us here, or what he's writing about here. He's asking nothing superhuman. By your silence, you will transform the world. By your silent presence, you will transform the world. But I love what he says here, educating others in confidence by the respect given them. In other words, the respect you show others, and I don't mean just that you keep your distance or it's kind of a formality of respect. I mean you can let others be themselves. You can accept them as they are. Isn't that what love is? Right? To accept someone else just as they are, not to impose on them my demands, not to see them as I need them to be, not to make them into something that society says they have to be. Just let them be. You're educating them in confidence. Confidence in what? That God loves them, is how I'd put it. To really trust that. That will heal. That will heal that pain that Julian of Norwich calls sin. Thus, Merton continues, the contemplative is capable of allaying some of their fears and helping them to put up with themselves until they become interiorly quiet and learn to see God in the depths of their own poverty. So going into this experience of your own poverty, that is, of coming face to face with our falsity, our emptiness, going into what Merton calls again this experience of dread, it is not for you alone. And waking up to God in the silence is not for you alone. It's for humanity. And I might say today, it's not just for humanity, it's for all of creation. It's for the cosmos. This is an old medieval idea, too, that your awakening in God and my awakening in God not only will help every single person in the world, but it affects positively every blade of grass, every dandelion, every kangaroo and koala, and not just the ones suffering from that wildfire out in Australia, and every ant and every spider and everything in existence. It's a grand calling. But let's dig into this a little bit. So the first thing the contemplative offers to the world is pure and simple the experience of the mystery of God. But there's kind of almost like a 1A. This is the second thing the contemplative offers the world. And you can almost say it's a subset of that. It's an offshoot of that idea that the contemplative gives the experience of God to the world. The contemplative charts a way through the absence of God. It's a wonderful essay, highly recommend it, in Contemplation in a World of Action that Merton wrote called The Contemplative and the Atheist. This is just a portion of that. We are persuaded that many who consider themselves atheists are in fact persons who are discontented with the naive idea of God, which makes him appear to be an object or a thing or a person in a merely finite and human sense. The Christian contemplative is called mainly to penetrate the wordless darkness and apophatic light of an experience beyond concepts. And here he gradually becomes familiar with a God who is absent and, as it were, non-existent to all human experience. The apophatic experience of God does, to some extent, verify the atheist's intuition that God is not an object of limited and precise knowledge. And consequently, God cannot be apprehended as a thing to be studied. As St. John of the Cross dared to say in mystical language, the term of the ascent of the Mount of Contemplation is nothing. Apophatic, by the way, is an older word that means just no image. And that's the technical theological word for the experience of the nothingness of God. But he's saying here that as we settle into silence, and not just external silence, but more importantly, the internal silence, where we're not thinking, we're not using words, we're actually sharing in an experience that atheists have, although you might say in a converse way. They're experiencing, you might say, the absence of God and taking that to mean there is no God. And then Merton's saying, in a sense, they're right. That there's no God as we think. So it's just like what I said earlier. It's almost like the atheist intuits that most religion deals with God like it deals with Zeus. And the atheist is totally right. That God is not Zeus. God is not a particular being who's going to zap you if you do wrong. That the living God of the Bible, Yahweh, who says, I am who I am, is pure being and at the same time pure nothingness. There's that paradox. Again, Merton likes to talk in these kind of paradoxes because he knows that God is beyond the mind. And then he goes back to this theme in inner experience. Nietzsche, he says, speaking for our world, proclaimed that God was dead. And that is why in our contemplation, God must often seem to be absent, as though dead. But the truth of our contemplation is in this: never more than today has he made his presence felt by being absent. In this, then, we are most faithful, that we prefer the darkness and in the very depths of our being value this emptiness and apparent absence. We need not struggle vainly to make him present. If such struggles are a mockery, leave nothingness as it is. In it, he is present. It's remarkable because this is not a way of debating atheists. This is a way of actually sharing a common ground with them. And a common ground that is beyond words and beyond thoughts. Every religion comes to that point where the sometimes cultural and linguistic expressions of a certain faith fail, and you need to go down deep into silence. Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, Islam, all the major religions, they tend towards that. And if you were to ask any maybe in-the-know practitioner of any of these religions, they'd say, yeah, that's where everything's leading. Very much so in Christianity. This is the experience of God that Merton wants to communicate. This is a poem he wrote, and it's called Gelassenheit. You were in the Merton class. You remember, Gelassenheit means releasement. Desert and void. The uncreated is waste and emptiness to the creature. Not even sand, not even stone, not even darkness and night. A burning wilderness would at least be something. It burns and is wild, but the uncreated is no something. Waste, emptiness, total poverty of the Creator. Yet from this poverty springs everything. The waste is inexhaustible, infinite zero. Everything comes from this desert nothing. Everything wants to return to it and cannot. For who can return nowhere? But for each of us, there is a point of nowhereness in the middle of movement, a point of nothingness in the midst of being, the incomparable point, not to be discovered by insight. If you seek it, you do not find it. If you stop seeking, it is there. But you must not turn to it. Once you become aware of yourself as seeker, you are lost. But if you are content to be lost, you will be found without knowing it, precisely because you are lost. For you are at last nowhere. To penetrate that experience, to go down deep into the darkness, the silence, and there to share with the atheist something is what the contemplative offers the world. A second thing the contemplative offers the world. The third thing is that the contemplative is a living critique of the world. You recall that he died in the late 60s while he was on a trip in Bangkok, Thailand, and he was giving a talk to a group of Catholic monks who from Asia who came to listen to this great American master. But in that talk, it's weird, he actually talked about socialism and what that might mean maybe for the contemplative life. But more specifically about what that could mean for the monastic life. Whenever he's writing about monks, even though he does mean specifically Trappists, Benedictines, Carthusians, also here, a monk in Greek is monakos. And monakos doesn't mean an institutional, canonical religious life. It means the single one. It means the person who is seeking oneness with God. That's what the monk is. In other words, it's just anybody longing for the longing for unity with God, you could say. So this is what he writes. It's a little sentence from his last talk before he died. The monk is essentially someone who takes up a critical attitude toward the world and its structures. The monk is somebody who says in one way or another that the claims of the world are fraudulent. They're fraudulent, by the way, because they're passing, for the most part. Everything is passing. And Merton would have picked that up just as much from the gospel. That passage, beautiful passage, the birds of the air, the flowers of the field. But at least I often forget that Jesus says, the grass that is grown and that is thrown in the oven tomorrow. It's an image of ephemerality. Or if you go to Ecclesiastes, Ecclesiastes is all about the ephemeral, right? Life comes and life goes. Everything passes away. Nothing is forever. But he probably also got it from Buddhism, or at least maybe that sense was deepened by his contact with Buddhism, that everything is passing away. Have you heard about this scandal with this media scandal with Bernie Sanders, the quote Bernie Bros? And before that, I'm just thinking of all the scandals that have been happening in the past few weeks with just the Democratic. I'm not even going Republican. I'm just thinking of the Democratic candidates. And it was remember back in January, Elizabeth Warren and Bernie had a fight. Oh, they had a big fight. It's like Mom and Dad of America were fighting. Well, what happened? That passed. And with this Bernie bro thing, it'll pass too. But it's also that especially that Bernie bro thing really got me thinking. And I think it's something that's also happening on the right. It's that we tend to project our needs onto a leader. So it doesn't matter what side we're on. And it doesn't have to be like far left or far right. It can be a pretty good moderate. It could be Barack Obama. It could be George W. Bush. It doesn't matter who it is. It doesn't matter what your politics are. We will project our needs onto that person, right? That's the claim that is fraudulent. Because I hear that, what people are saying when they maybe offer some valid criticism of Senator Sanders, and then people on Twitter will just go down, jump on them and just voraciously attack them with tweets. And I think, there's a little hero worship going on here. The claim that, the contemplative is deconstructing is the claim that anything is lasting forever, is the claim that anything is God except God. And unfortunately, if we are in a world that is purely secular, even if we are religious people, we're affected by this secular consciousness. So I wouldn't say that the world is secular. I'd say that there's a secular consciousness that is pretty much in all areas of life. Churches equally as much as malls. That attitude will look for some God to worship. Wasn't it John Calvin who said the human heart is an idol factory? Great line. It's an idol factory. It's going to find something to worship. And so if you want to put it biblically, the contemplative is fiercely dedicated to the first commandment. Fiercely dedicated to the first commandment. There is no God but God. So guess what? Bernie Sanders is not God. Donald Trump is not God. But everybody, Barack Obama is not God, And you can go way past leaders in politics. You can say the Catholic Church is not God. The Episcopalian Church is not God. The bishop is not God. I hope the bishops know that. I'm not sure sometimes the Catholic bishops know that. There's nothing that's God except God. But that, honestly, by being this living critique, it's not just a negative critique. The best criticism of the bad is actually the practice of the better. It's not that the contemplative stands on the corner in the city square and says, "You're all idol worshipers," and points the finger. It's that the contemplative just turns away from all of that and chooses to live in God. In other words, it's a wholly, totally, irreversibly positive choice. That is the living critique on the world. It's not a critique that tears down and judges and blames. It's a critique that offers life. Because the contemplative, by being silent and in solitude, can begin to see God in everything. So there's a reconciliation of this paradox between God, who is this transcendent mystery, this nothingness beyond being, and yet merciful, intimate presence closer to me than I am to myself. And so you might know the famous experience Thomas Merton had. It was not even in the monastery. He was out in what was the street in Walnut Street, I think it was, in what's the city in Kentucky? Louisville. Or Lexington? Maybe it was in Lexington. I don't remember the city, but he just claims he was on a city street, and he's just said, everyone is shining like the sun. Everyone. That's what the contemplative offers. It's not a condemnatory critique. It's a, don't you know? Don't you know you're made for so much more? But it's not even that. It's that we show the world a wholly better path by living it. By living it. And saying, that pain that you're in, you don't have to live that way. You don't have to live that way. In fact, there's healing, there's life, and there's light. Come with me. I don't know if my friends would say this, but I could say this, that when I met Basil Pennington, that's pretty much what I came away with. That, man, this is a man who has given his life to God, and he's happy. He is happy. That's what I came away with. Like, there's a happiness that is available to us that this world cannot give. Right? What does Jesus say right before he dies at the Last Supper? My joy will be in you and my joy will be complete, but it's a joy that the world cannot give. Something like that, right? Last week, I ended with this sentence from Thoughts in Solitude. But when you are this living critique of the world and you're offering this wholly new way of life, Merton says, it's no longer prayer time segmented throughout the day. It's not you have prayer time, and then you have grocery store time, and then you have time with your kids, and then you have bedtime, and then you have TV time. He says all of life becomes prayer. So that grocery time, kid time, TV time, it's all prayer. Let me seek then the gift of silence and poverty and solitude, where everything I touch is turned into prayer, where the sky is my prayer, the birds are my prayer, the wind in the trees is my prayer, for God is all in all. That's the critique the contemplative offers the world, that everything is prayer. Because we're living under this illusion that God is in some places, beautiful places like this, but maybe not in other places, like our kitchens, or our dining rooms, or the Safeway, or the Capitol. The Capitol is one I'm not quite sure about, actually. Not so sure about that. So he wrestles with this question. What does the contemplative life mean, in his words, in the atomic age? What can it mean, he says? Has it lost all meaning, whatever? But to this question he replies, a certain depth of disciplined experience is a necessary ground for fruitful action. So part of the critique is not just that happiness is only found in God or that everything is passing away, but the critique is that if we're going to act in this world, we're not going to be fruitful unless we have some silence and some solitude. In other words, there's no real working for justice without contemplative prayer. And that's in the biblical sense, that you cannot really work for justice unless you're working for justice in God. And then he says, real Christian living is stunted and frustrated if it remains content with the bare externals of worship, with saying prayers and going to church, with fulfilling one's external duties and merely being respectable. Folks, that's most of people in America, right? That's most of religion, period. Let's just go to church to be respectable. Maybe that's a little too honest. But just the bare externals of worship. I would say, if I'm going to be honest, I think, I'm just speaking for the Catholic churches I've personally attended and served at. That's probably true of a fair amount of the parishioners. That's probably true of more than half, at least. And I think I'm being very, very generous. The real purpose of prayer, he says, is the deepening of personal realization in love. You see, we'll all come back to love. What he did for Jim Finley when Jim was a novice and barely even 20, just talking about pigs every night before Vespers, was a way to heal Jim's experience from his past of his abusive father. Just two guys talking about pigs. It was a relationship that helped heal James Finley from this pain. I bet every one of you in this room has done something similar. That you didn't bring out, a prayer book or even the Bible, but you just sat with somebody. One of my most treasured memories is of my grandfather coming to the emergency room because I was suffering from an infection. I was in a lot of pain. I think I was a teenager at the time. My mom was running around in the ER and just trying to get a doctor or a nurse or someone to give me some sort of medicine. But the hospital was very close to my grandparents' house. So Grandpa came over. He was not a speaker. He wasn't someone who talked a lot. I get this from my dad, not from him. Grandpa didn't talk a lot. But Grandpa sat there. Pop-up, is that who I called him? He just sat with me. I have a lot of memories of him, but that's my favorite memory. That he just sat with me. That's what love is, right? That compassion, is that word. That word means to suffer with. That's what the contemplative does. So, at one and the same time, the contemplative is a person who transmits the experience of God, charts a way through the absence of God, and offers a living critique of the world. And in doing that, all at once, just by being present, healing the world. Merton continues, he who attempts to act and do things for others or for the world without deepening his own self-understanding, freedom, integrity, and capacity to love will not have anything to give others. He will communicate to them nothing but the contagion of his own obsessions, his aggressiveness, his ego-centered ambitions, his delusions about ends and means, his doctrinaire prejudices and ideas. Again, he's writing this in the 60s. We are living through the greatest crisis in the history of man. And the crisis is centered precisely in the country that has made a fetish out of action and has lost, or perhaps never had, the sense of contemplation. Far from being irrelevant, contemplation is of the utmost importance in America today. Because contemplation has a part to play in opening up new ways and new horizons. That's what the contemplative offers the world, according to Thomas Merton. So I'd like to give you some time now to talk in groups, and we'll come back, talk a little bit more, answer some questions or comments. But I'm going to turn it over to Peg to break you out into groups. Oh, okay, great. Then you'll turn it over to Lisa. Contemplation in a world of action. He who attempts to act and do things for others or for the world without deepening his own self-understanding, freedom, integrity, and capacity to love will not have anything to give others. He will communicate to them nothing but the contagion of his own obsessions, his aggressiveness, his ego-centered ambitions, his delusions about ends and means, his doctrinaire prejudices and ideas. And I'll throw in another sentence. There is nothing more tragic in the modern world than the misuse of power and action to which men are driven by their own Faustian misunderstandings and misapprehensions. That's what we communicate when we're not in contemplation. All right. Questions, comments, quibbles, concerns? Anything at all? Sure. So contemplatives, this is just based on my reading of Thomas Merton, but he says this in different ways throughout his writings. Contemplatives first transmit the experience of the mystery of God. Second, they chart a way through the feeling of God's absence. And third, they offer a living critique to the world, which is both a critique of its false claims that happiness can be found only here, for instance, or that anything here is lasting, but also a very positive critique in that you don't need to live like this. You can live a wholly different life where there's joy and peace and freedom. Sure? Anything else? So I assume you have it all figured out? Oh, sure.
I think what you've given us, and I don't know if it's still needed, but a real sense, a deeper understanding of what it means to be contemplative and how that fits in the world.
Yeah, sure.
And so I think it's been a great series, and thank you very much.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thanks for coming. Thank you for coming.